During the Vietnam War, one of the most common legal ways to avoid the draft in the United States was through education. Young men enrolled in colleges and universities receiving what were called student deferments. This allowed them to legally postpone military service until after graduation. However, this option was far from universal. It became a loophole mainly used by the middle class, which led to growing social tension and resentment. Another popular method was obtaining medical exemptions. Many draftees pretended to have illnesses, especially mental health issues, back pain, or nervous breakdowns. It wasn't unusual for young men to look for sympathetic doctors willing to sign off on exemptions. One well-known example is Donald Trump, who received a medical deferment due to bone spurs. As a result, the medical category became something of a safe haven for those trying to stay out of the war. Many also tried to join the National Guard or the reserves. Serving in these units greatly reduced the risk of being sent into combat, and by 1970 nearly 90% of eligible men were attempting to get in. This was another legal escape route, widely used by those unwilling to go to the front lines. In 1969, a draft lottery was introduced to make the conscription process more fair by distributing duty assignments randomly. But while it helped somewhat, social inequality persisted. Many still managed to avoid service through influence, status, or clever maneuvering. Legal and bureaucratic factors also played a key role. Local draft boards often allowed privileged young men to delay service through corruption or personal connections. Lawyers and civil rights advocates fought in court to challenge these practices, creating a long trail of legal precedents. In the end, the legal ways to avoid fighting in Vietnam were numerous and closely tied to social status, access to education, and medical resources. These mechanisms had a profound effect on American society, fueling a sense of injustice and division, splitting a generation between those who dodged the war and those who fought on the battlefield. During the Vietnam War, a mass movement of conscientious objectors emerged, people who refused to take part in the war on moral, religious, or political grounds. This status, known as a conscientious objector, allowed them to legally refuse military service in exchange for performing alternative civilian work. But gaining this status was far from easy. Draft boards often rejected such applications, and decisions were made locally, influenced by personal bias and the prevailing political mood. Many rejections were challenged in court, turning the process into a long and exhausting legal struggle. By the end of the war, the number of registered conscientious objectors had reached record levels, more than 61,000 in 1971, and in total, around 170,000 Americans either obtained this status or were convicted for refusing the draft. Two of the movement's most notable figures were boxer Muhammad Ali and activist David Harris. Ali refused to serve in the war because of his moral and religious beliefs, which led to his conviction and the loss of his boxing titles. Over time, however, public opinion shifted. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction, affirming the right to refuse military service on grounds of conscience. David Harris, on the other hand, chose to go to prison, becoming a symbol of civil disobedience and organizing the resistance movement, which coordinated protests and supported draft resistors. Conscientious objectors were often harshly criticized by conservative parts of society who saw them as cowards or traitors. Yet many others viewed their refusal as a courageous moral choice, a protest against a war they believed to be unjust and immoral. For these men, resisting the draft was not an act of fear, but one of conscience, a way to preserve their humanity in the midst of a brutal conflict. This chapter reveals the moral and legal dimensions of draft resistance and the importance of the conscientious objector movement, which became a vital part of America's anti-war protest and changed how the nation understood war, patriotism, and personal integrity. During the Vietnam War, tens of thousands of young Americans chose a radical path, fleeing the country to avoid the draft. Over the course of the conflict, an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 people left the United States, escaping to Canada, Sweden, and other countries. Another 50,000 soldiers deserted, leaving the military either during combat or after returning home. Emigration became not only an act of protest, but also a way to save one's life. Many fled in secret, fearing arrest, and faced serious challenges. Officially, American deserters had no right to asylum, and some were turned back at the border. In Canada and Sweden, networks of support gradually formed. Churches and activists helped with housing and jobs, offered legal aid, and campaigned for the acceptance of draft resistors. Inside the United States, an underground network took shape. Friends, activists, and relatives worked together to hide draft evaders from the authorities, providing shelter, false documents, and safe routes between cities. For many, living underground meant years of isolation and constant fear of being caught. These experiences gave rise to an entire underground community, with its own heroes and organizers who risked their freedom for their ideals. The stories of deserters and exiles later became subjects of heated public debate. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter announced an amnesty, allowing thousands to return home. But for many, coming back brought mixed emotions: the rejection of conservative America, personal guilt, and new moral dilemmas. This chapter reveals not only the scale of the escape, but also its human cost, fear and uncertainty, the redefinition of patriotism, the search for one's identity far from home, and resistance to a war they could not accept. For many young Americans, emigration and life in hiding became their last chance to avoid the battlefield, a choice that changed their lives forever. During the Vietnam War, many draft resistors and conscientious objectors faced prosecution and criminal charges. By various estimates, around 170,000 Americans either received conscientious objector status or were convicted for refusing the draft. The authorities sought to suppress the protest movement, yet they found themselves confronting growing public discontent. One of the most famous trials of that era was the case of legendary boxer Muhammad Ali. In 1967, Ali refused military service, citing his religious faith and moral convictions. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined, but his legal team appealed the decision. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction, affirming the right to refuse military service on grounds of conscience. The case became a powerful symbol of resistance and inspired many others to stand against the war. Court trials became a significant part of the anti-war movement. Activists who burned draft cards or refused mobilization were prosecuted, but as public protests grew stronger, punishments grew less severe. By the early 1970s, public opinion had shifted dramatically, and calls for amnesty and an end to the war echoed even among political leaders. Public reaction remained deeply divided. Conservative Americans often labeled draft resistors as traitors and deserters. Meanwhile, many others, especially young people and members of the counterculture, supported the resistance movement. Massive anti-war demonstrations, concerts, and cultural protests began reshaping how Americans understood patriotism and duty. By the end of the war, these trials had become cumbersome and politically damaging for the government. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter declared an amnesty for those who had evaded the draft or taken part in protests, marking the end of one of the most controversial chapters in U.S. history. This chapter highlights the complex legal and moral debates, the public struggle, and the central role of court battles in shaping the American anti-war movement. The Vietnam War became one of the most profound and painful upheavals in the history of the United States. At first, the country experienced a brief surge of unity, a phenomenon often described as the rally around the flag effect. But it soon became clear that the nation was deeply divided between those who supported the war and those who saw it as unjust and meaningless. A key force in this divide was the younger generation, the baby boomers, students, and members of the counterculture, who became the driving power of the anti-war movement. Universities turned into centers of protest and debate, where students questioned government policy and the purpose of the war itself. Massive marches, rallies, cultural events, and campus revolutions shaped a new generation with a different understanding of patriotism and civic duty. The openness of the media played a critical role. Thanks to independent journalists and photographers, Americans saw the war unfiltered, the bloodshed, the casualties, the bombings of villages. These images dramatically changed how the nation perceived the conflict. Public trust eroded further after the exposure of war crimes, such as the My Lai massacre, which became symbols of moral and political failure. This period gave rise to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a widespread rejection of military interventions and a lasting turn toward pacifism. The syndrome also affected returning veterans, many of whom struggled with post-traumatic stress, alienation, and the pain of feeling misunderstood by their own society. Ultimately, the Vietnam War left a deep and lasting mark on America's political, social, and cultural life. It exposed the complexities and contradictions of militarism, reshaped how Americans viewed power, patriotism, and foreign conflict, and left behind painful lessons that the nation would wrestle with for decades to come. The Vietnam War left deep and painful scars on the United States, politically, socially, and economically. Over the years of the conflict, more than 58,000 American servicemen were killed and hundreds of thousands were wounded, making it one of the heaviest blows to the U.S. military since World War II. Politically, the war triggered a massive crisis of trust between citizens and their government, as well as the military leadership. Revelations of corruption in South Vietnam and the failure to achieve the Pentagon's objectives led to a loss of confidence in the authorities. This period was marked by the rise of powerful anti-war movements and a deep social divide that the United States would continue to feel for many years after withdrawing from Indochina. Economically, the war imposed enormous costs. Adjusted for today's value, its total expenses approach $1 trillion. These expenditures fueled inflation, increased taxes, and worsened the financial situation of many Americans, intensifying social tensions across the nation. On the cultural level, the war gave rise to what became known as the Vietnam Syndrome, a lasting distrust of military interventions and a growing pacifist sentiment within society. Returning veterans often faced misunderstanding, hostility, and serious challenges in readjusting to civilian life, including post-traumatic stress. The war deeply changed the American view of patriotism, warfare, and national duty. In international politics, the defeat in Vietnam weakened the United States' position and exposed the limits of its military power and influence. Yet, despite the setback, America did not abandon its role as a global leader. Instead, it learned from this painful experience, reshaping its strategy and approach to foreign policy for decades to come. The Vietnam War was not only a military and political test for the United States, but also a profound psychological trauma for millions of people. Soldiers returning from the front often faced severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, alcoholism, and social isolation. More than 500,000 Vietnam veterans struggled with the war's aftermath for years after their return. Society, at times, rejected its own heroes, seeing them as sources of problems, or remembering them through the painful lens of the conflict itself. The widespread anti-war movement created mixed attitudes toward veterans. On one hand, sympathy, but on the other, suspicion and alienation. This division followed them into civilian life, making adaptation and reintegration into society extremely difficult. The psychological wounds of veterans also influenced the cultural sphere. Literature, music, and film saw a surge of works dedicated to the experiences of those who fought and their struggles. These creations helped society recognize and accept the complex legacy of the war, driving social change and fostering greater support for those affected. The Vietnam War also became a catalyst for the development of psychiatric care for veterans, the creation of rehabilitation programs, and the rise of advocacy movements for former soldiers' rights. The lessons learned from this conflict led to a re-evaluation of the military's role and its responsibility for the mental health of its personnel, setting new standards for psychological support. In this way, the consequences of the Vietnam War reached far beyond politics and economics, profoundly reshaping the emotional and psychological landscape of millions of Americans, and transforming their attitudes toward military service and patriotism.